How many of you have watched the movie called The Jesus Film? Any of you seen that? Here's a picture of it. You might recognize this from the movie. You ever seen the Jesus movie with that particular guy on it? Maybe kind of remember the Jesus Film. It was made in 1979, and if you compare it to today's modern film standards, it's not all that engaging, really. I mean, there's low production value. Jesus looks like an Anglo from North America, doesn't even look like a Jew. And yet the film has been shown constantly since it was made with unprecedented results. It has actually been translated into 1,530 languages. It's been shown to a worldwide audience of 7.5 billion people, as many people as there are in the world, or more than there are in the world today. The number of people who, after watching the film, have made a decision to follow Jesus Christ is 490 million people have said yes to Christ as a result of this film. And then they introduced it into electronic media in 2016, so now it can be watched on YouTube, which in many developing countries, when they start laying infrastructure in some of third world countries, they don't lay phone lines like we used to have, the landlines, because it's just too expensive. So they go immediately to cell phones. So they have towers everywhere. I've been in the middle of the jungles of Guatemala and been able to get cell phone calls in the middle of nowhere because they have networks all around the place. And so since they introduced it to YouTube in 2016, 45,771,752 people have viewed the movie. And so it is just making an impact all over the world. In fact, I just looked up and found this report on Global Partners. That's the Wesleyan arm of our missions work in the Wesleyan Church. Last year, just in 2016, a Mozambican Jesus Film team went to a village in Mozambique and were showing the Jesus Film. And in the crowd was a local sheikh who was watching it, who belonged to the mosque in that area. And over the next 3 months, the sheikh and his wife and 40 other Muslims decided to follow Jesus, and they took their mosque and they turned it into a Wesleyan church. And so soon there were 40 new Christ followers who were baptized in the name of Jesus to the glory of God, and they traced that all back to the power of this film and the message when they saw it translated in their own language. So it's not the most dramatic film to watch. It would not have the production value, say, of what was the movie The Passion? If you saw that, the production values are that was a high-budget Hollywood movie. It's not like that. It's made in 79, and yet it's had an incredibly profound impact. God is using it, really, in unprecedented ways, and the reason for its power is that it's a simple retelling of the greatest story that has ever been told. People, I think, underestimate the power of story to be able to reach into a heart and grab someone, not only intellectually, but grab their emotions and draw them. And that's why most of the Bible is communicated in story form. Throughout most of the Old Testament and even into a lot of the New Testament, it's story after story, because story has the power to communicate. And that's why your testimony, your story, is the most powerful tool that you can use to reach someone for Jesus. Now, last week I put up a whiteboard in the front and I drew some pictures on it. You can bring that slide back up now. And this is kind of what was on that whiteboard. And if you look at this with me for just a moment, I shared with you last week that I talked about mission. And our mission is to make disciples who make disciples. And at the top is our vision, and I've got that to be determined because we're going to hammer out the vision over the next several months, because the vision is what this place will look like in 1 year, 3 years, 5 years if we do the mission. If we're faithful in the mission, here's what we'll look like as a church. Strategy are the stair steps to get us to that vision. And we looked last week at touches, showing God's love in a practical way, ways that we can touch people with acts of kindness. By the way, we put up that kindness board in the foyer. You might have seen that when you walked in if you weren't here last week. That's filled with all kinds of random acts of kindness that you can do. Last week I was hoping maybe at least 30 people would take a slip, but you took every single slip on the board. There were 84 slips taken, so 84 acts of kindness were being shown throughout the community. I had one gentleman that came up to me this morning and he said, I had a neighbor, an elderly man, who was mowing a very steep bank, and you could tell he was having a hard time with it. So I went over and I asked him, if I could mow his bank for him. And he wanted to know, why in the world would you want to do that? And he just said, well, I want to show God's love in a tangible way. And so he got it. He understood that you do an act of kindness, and when they ask you why you're doing it, simple answer, I want to show God's love in a practical way. And he was able to mow the guy's bank for him. I mean, people just don't do that kind of thing. And yet he was willing to step out. And that's what we want you to do. As you can, matter of fact, I've replenished the board. There's a whole new board there of acts of kindness. I've added some new types of things in there. And so remember to take a slip off when you leave, sign your name on the smiley face, put the smiley face back, and let's continue to reach out into our community, because as we do acts of kindness and somebody says to us, why are you doing that? I just want to show God's love in a practical way. Then they may then respond back, well, tell me a little bit more about that. And then that gives us our second part of the strategy, which is testimony, to tell our story. So over the next 18 months, this is our strategy for reaching our vision, to make touches of kindness throughout our community and allow that to move us into an opportunity to share our story or to share our testimony. So that's what I want to talk to you about today, is our testimony, telling your story. In the book of Revelation, the angels are celebrating the people of God who have overcome the attacks of the Antichrist and the whole power of Satan in the world, and they detail the ways that they were successful. And so in Revelation chapter 12, verse 11, they celebrate, they say, they have defeated him being Satan or his Antichrist. They have defeated him by the blood of the Lamb. So that's the first thing that Christ has done. By dying on the cross and rising from the dead, he's destroyed the power of Satan. But then they had to do their part too, and they add, and by their testimony, and they did not love their lives so much that they were afraid to die. So they were willing to share their story over and over, even to the point of death, and that continuous, courageous determination literally changed the world. It turned the world upside down in the days of the early church. So the Apostle Peter said that it's important for us to be ready to share that story. In 1 Peter 3:15, Peter wrote, instead, you must worship Christ as Lord of your life, and if someone asks about your Christian hope, always be ready to explain it. So you're doing an act of kindness for somebody. They want to know why you're doing this. I want to show God's love in a practical way. And if they want to understand, why do you have that kind of hope? Why are you, I don't get that. Then you have to be ready to share why this hope is within you. And and that's where testimony comes in, being able to share our message. I'm going to give you some detailed training on this, by the way. I'm going to preach today about sharing our story in general terms, but this is a ways away yet. But if you want to write in a calendar, November 1st, that's a Wednesday night, we're going to actually have roundtable meeting in this room with everybody that will come, and we're going to actually go through a training time of how to write and how to share your story with people that you may not know. So it'll help take away the fear, it'll help take away the uneasiness about it, and be some practical training. But let me just talk to you generally about it today. You know, when people encounter a witnessing situation, they get nervous because they're afraid that they won't know what to say. I mean, we ask, what if they ask questions that I don't know how to answer? Or what if they challenge my faith? How do I respond to that? And so we're fearful of talking to people because of those possibilities coming our way. But the great truth is that you don't need to be a scholar. You don't need to be a biblical theologian in order to tell how Jesus has changed your life. You don't need to be highly educated in order to tell your story. And I love the story in the New Testament where Jesus healed the man that was born blind in the synagogue, and he was beside himself with joy, and the Pharisees were questioning him about it because they couldn't understand exactly what was going on, and they were antagonistic toward Jesus. And I love the exchange between him and the Pharisees, because this was a guy that was uneducated, but Jesus had touched him, and he simply told his story. Look at it with me on the screen. In John chapter 5, verse 15, it says, the Pharisees asked the man all about it. So he told them, he put the mud over my eyes, and when I washed it away, I could see. Some of the Pharisees said, this man Jesus is not from God, for he is working on the Sabbath. Others said, but how could an ordinary sinner do such miraculous signs? So there was a deep division of opinion among them. Then the Pharisees again questioned the man who had been blind and demanded, what's your opinion about this man who healed you? Now listen to this. The man replied, I think he must be a prophet. The Jewish leaders still refused to believe the man had been blind and could now see, so they called in his parents. They asked them, "Is this your son? Was he born blind? If so, how can he see?" His parents replied, "We know this is our son and that he was born blind, but we don't know how he can see or who healed him. Ask him. He's old enough to speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders who had announced that anyone saying Jesus was the Messiah would be expelled from the synagogue. That's why they said, "He's old enough, ask him." So for the second time, they called in the man who had been born blind and told him, "God should get glory for this because we know this man, Jesus, is a sinner." And then he just simply says, "I don't know whether he's a sinner." The man replied, "But I know this, I was blind and now I can see." "But what did he do?" they asked. "How did he heal you?" "Look," the man explained, "I told you once. Didn't you listen? Why do you want to hear about it? Do you want to become one of his disciples too?" I love that. They're just like probably getting really ticked off. And then they cursed him and said, "You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know God spoke to Moses, but we don't even know where this man comes from." "Why, that's very strange," the man replied. "He healed my eyes, and yet you don't know where he comes from? We know that God doesn't listen to sinners, but he is ready to heal those who worship him and do his will. Ever since the world began, no one has ever been able to open the eyes of someone born blind. If this man were not from God, he couldn't have done it." "You were born a total sinner," they answered. "You are trying to teach us?" And they threw him out of the synagogue. So he's just like, "Look, man, I don't know where the guy came from. I don't know who he is, but here's what I know. I couldn't see, and now I can see." So he's just simply telling his story. I was blind, Jesus touched me, and now I can see. And that's really what our testimony is. That's our story. How do you argue with that? They couldn't argue with it. They ended up kicking him out of the synagogue because they couldn't say anything. The dude was obviously changed. He had been healed by Jesus. And so you really can't refute that. So you don't have to memorize a sermon. You don't have to memorize some kind of a speech. When you're telling your story to someone, all you need to do is tell your story. And there's some great advantages to it. The first advantage is that it's personal. You know, this is your story. It's not anyone else's. You don't have to memorize Bible verses. You don't have to worry about telling it correctly because this is something that happened to you. And so you just relay what took place. And because it's your story, you can simply recall. I mean, you know when something's happened to you, it's very easy to tell. You don't even think about it. You don't try to memorize it when some event occurs in your life. You're not trying to write it down to remember it. You just know it because it happened to you. That's what John said in 1 John chapter 1, verse 3. He said, "We proclaim to you what we have seen and heard." We just are telling you what happened to us. And so that's how you tell your story. Another reason that it's powerful to tell your stories because it's conversational. You know, this isn't a sermon. This isn't a prepared speech. You can share this over a cup of coffee. You can share this after a round of golf. It's just very casual and conversational. I was so proud, in a good way, so proud of my guys that are in my discipleship group this week. We meet over at the Health and Restoration Center here in town, and my guys are just really grabbing a hold of this idea of wanting to reach people who are either brand new in their faith or who haven't even come to faith in Christ yet. And so we meet on Wednesdays at 7 o'clock, as soon as the Wednesday night Bible study is done. So my guys left early. I had stayed till the meeting was over, and then I slipped out the door as quickly as I could to get over there. But my guys left a little bit early, and they got pizzas, and they took them over to the facility. And the reason they did is because there's an AA meeting that happens just before our meeting, and it gets done at 6:30. And so a lot of those guys leave, but they didn't want them to leave. So they brought pizzas in. And so when I arrived a little after 7, there's like 30 people in there milling around, all people from all kinds of backgrounds and people that are, some of them are just now discovering Christ. Some of them are not yet there. But, if you bring food, people will stay. And my guys they're getting it. They're hungry because they want to reach out. So one of them volunteered and said, "You know what, once a month I could bring my grill and some burgers, and we could cook burgers maybe to keep them." And so they're already becoming creative about how can we connect and make connections. Well, when it came time for our group to finally sit around the table, about 4 of the 30 stayed and joined us around the table. And what I did that night is I asked them 3 questions because I wanted them to get experience telling their story in front of people they don't know. So I asked 3 questions, one at a time. First question was, what was your life like before you met Jesus? And so they went around the room and each just told his story. And The people who joined us that were new to us, they told their story too. It was great. And then I asked the question, how did you meet Jesus? And then the third question, how has Jesus changed your life since you've met him? And it was so powerful to listen to these guys just conversationally, it wasn't any kind of a prepared speech. They didn't even know I was going to ask the question. But just naturally, they just began to share out of their experience. And there was a real sense of God's presence in that meeting as we were talking with these people. Everyone that was around the table that was new to the group, they all were just starting out in their faith, been delivered from gangs, one from a gang, been delivered from drug addiction. And they're just now really starting to try to put their lives back together, and to hear the power of God expressed in casual tones was just incredibly impacting. So proud of my guys for being willing to do that and having that desire to reach out to people. But it's conversational. You don't have to have a prepared speech. It's conversational. Another benefit is that no one can dispute it. Your story is what happened to you. And so it's not like someone can argue with you. If you try to present theology, they can argue with you about theology. You present your story, that's what happened to you. They're not going to argue with you about that. And then fourth, it's interesting. I mean, people like stories. And even people who are antagonistic to Christ may be interested in hearing your story, because they may be interested in knowing why you believe in this man called Jesus. So tell your story. Do acts of kindness. Go out and take a kindness slip off the board this week and pray over that slip of paper, whatever it is. Maybe it's take cookies to my neighbor. Pray over that slip that God will open up a door of conversation. Engage in that act of kindness. When they ask you why you're doing it, your answer, again, very simply, I just want to show God's love in a practical way. And then if they ask further what that's all about, tell them your story. Just say, well, let me tell you a story. And I'm going to tell you how to tell your story. In fact, the Apostle Paul gives us a great model for telling our story, or you could say testimony. Paul had to stand before King Agrippa, just as he was on his way to trial in Rome. And he shared his story. And really in the text in the book of Acts, it breaks his story up into three parts. He talks to us about what happened before he met Christ. He talks about how he met Christ, and then he talks about what happened after he met Christ. Very simple the way he outlined it. So that's what I want to look at today, and I want to start with before. In Acts chapter 26, verses 9 to 11, Paul said, I used to believe that I ought to do everything I could to oppose the very name of Jesus of Nazareth. Indeed, I did just that in Jerusalem. Authorized by the leading priests, I caused many believers there to be sent to prison, and I cast my vote against them when they were condemned to death. Many times I had them punished in the synagogues to get them to curse Jesus. I was so violently opposed to them that I even chased them down in foreign cities. And so you just simply, as Paul did, tell what was your life like. Now, some of the stories we heard were dramatic the other night. I won't go into those details, but there were some stories that were quite dramatic. But some of the stories were not dramatic. Some of them lived pretty normal kinds of lives. In fact, that would be my case as I shared my story. I don't have this big life of horrible gangs and criminal activity and heroin addiction. That's not my story. I was raised in the church. I backslid away from Christ for a while and kind of got on a wrong path, made some bad decisions, but my story wasn't crazy. But what I did share and what was true about my life, even though I don't have some real dramatic kind of past, my heart was filled with hatred. My heart was filled with unforgiveness. My heart was filled with selfishness. I cared about nobody but me. And so I just shared out of my past that that's what was going on in my life before I met Jesus. So it's not dramatic, but it's my story. And so you can do the same thing. It may not be dramatic. You don't have to have this crazy testimony. It's just your story. Think about that. What was my heart like before Jesus came in and touched my life? The second thing we share is how we encountered Christ. Paul's, if you know the story of Paul's, incredibly dramatic. In Acts chapter 26, verse 12, it says, one day I was on such a mission to Damascus, armed with the authority and commission of the leading priests. About noon, Your Majesty, as I was on the road, a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, shone down on me and my companions. We fell down, and I heard a voice saying to me in Aramaic, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It is useless for you to fight against my will. "Who are you, Lord?" I asked. And the Lord replied, "I am Jesus, the one you are persecuting. Now get to your feet, for I have appeared to you to appoint you as my servant and witness. You are to tell the world what you have seen and what I will show you in the future. And I will rescue you from both your people and the Gentiles. Yes, I am sending you to the Gentiles to open their eyes so they may turn from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God. Then they will receive forgiveness for their sins and be given a place among God's people who are set apart by faith in me." And so, King Agrippa, I obeyed that vision from heaven. So he just described how it occurred. When our guys shared their stories, some of them had dramatic moments. They could pinpoint, this is when I met Jesus. This is how it happened. I can go right back to that moment. But there were some in the group that would say, I don't know if I can really pick a moment. I know it was kind of back in this period of time, but I know at one point I wasn't living for Christ, and at another point in my life I was, but I can't really go back and pinpoint a specific turning moment, but I encountered him. And that's okay. You don't have to, if you can't think of some dramatic crisis event, it's all right. The important thing is that you were living without him, and at some point your life changed, and now you're living with him. And so try to go back and think through how that occurred. Maybe it was a process, because here's the truth. Some people, their conversion story is a crisis. But for other people, it's not. It's a process. And Jesus said it would be that way. When Jesus was talking with Nicodemus and said, "Nicodemus, do not marvel that I say to you that one must be born again," or born from above, in order to see the kingdom of God. And as he talked to Nicodemus about that conversion, then he made this statement. He said that it's like the wind of the Spirit. You can't see the wind. You can't see it. You feel its effects, but you don't know where it's coming from. You don't know where it's going, but you know it's there because you can feel its effects. And then Jesus said to Nicodemus, "So is everyone who is born of the Spirit." There's this mystery in it that maybe we can't always fully pinpoint it, but we know something has happened in our lives. And so we have to think about that. How did I encounter Christ? How would I describe that? And then, so that's the before, that's the how, and then the after. After Christ has come into my life, how has my life changed? Paul says this in Acts 26:21, "Some Jews arrested me in the temple for preaching this, and they tried to kill me, but God has protected me right up to this present time, so I can testify to everyone from the least to the greatest. I teach nothing except what the prophets of Moses said would happen, that the Messiah would suffer and be the first to rise from the dead, and in this way announce God's light to Jews and Gentiles alike." So now he's describing what is my life like now after I've encountered Jesus Christ and began to follow him. So think through some of these questions maybe on your own as you're thinking about your story. What have you stopped doing since you met Jesus that you used to do? What have you started doing since you met Jesus that you didn't do before? How has Jesus given you hope? What does Jesus mean to you? One of the consistent, and this will be something that I think will help you as you're talking to people. One of the consistent themes that arose as each one went around the table, not just the guys that I'm discipling, but our guests that were with us, this came to the surface in every single account. And all of their accounts were varied and really different. But every single one had this common denominator. Before they met Jesus Christ, they were hungry for and looking for love. They just wanted to be loved, and they wanted to be able to love. They didn't maybe say it that way, but as we talked about it, after everyone told their story, we kind of talked it together about that and processed it. That's what we realized. Every single person was looking for love. They wanted to be loved. And with the difference that Jesus made is that he filled that desire and that need for love in their life. That's what Jesus does. So how has Jesus done that in you? How has he come in and filled that need to be loved and filled that need to be able to express love? So it doesn't have to be dramatic. It just needs to be a true account of your encounter with Jesus. Now let me just give you a couple more tips, if you will, some things to keep in mind when you're telling your story, and then we'll kind of wrap things up. But here's a couple things to keep in mind. First of all, this is a story. It is not a sales pitch. All right? That's really important. You're not trying to close a deal here. You're just telling your story. Let the Holy Spirit unravel it as you tell your story, because you can turn this thing. I used to do this. You can turn this kind of into a sales presentation and start overcoming their objections, and you're working real hard to just get them down to that moment that they'll say a prayer with you. And sometimes we leave people with this false impression that if we can get them just to repeat some words, that boom, they're saved. And we can sometimes lead people into a false assurance when maybe that's not where they are. Now, you may talk to some people and they're ripe and they're ready to cross the line of commitment to Jesus, but on average it takes at least 10 touches for somebody to come to the place where they're willing to cross the line from unbelief to faith in Jesus Christ. And so your story may be simply one of those touches in the process that God is bringing into that person's life to bring them to a place where they say yes to Jesus Christ. So this is not a sales pitch. This is just you simply telling your story and cooperating with the Holy Spirit, who's using you as one of those touches to help a person move towards faith in Christ. You, again, may be the 10th touch. Who knows? Maybe 9 other people have gone before you, and that person is absolutely ripe and ready. They want to commit their life to Jesus right then. Wonderful. But that is the exception. That's not the norm. All right. Secondly, when you're talking to people about your story, avoid Christianese. We have our own language. I don't know if you realize that, but because we have kind of been in this Christian bubble, I talked to you about the bubble here a few weeks ago, we've developed our own language within this Christian bubble. As a matter of fact, I want to show you what I mean. Watch this video. Yeah, we got our own language, and so we want to be careful about using Christian slogans that people out in the community would be like, I don't have a clue what you're talking about. Don't tell anybody that you've been saved because you've been washed in the blood. They'll think you're part of some creepy cult if you tell them you've been washed in. You and I know what that means. They're not going to know what that means, so we have to be careful about that. Here's the third thing. The key to a testimony, to a story, is to point to Jesus. Even though it's your story, the power is not in your past sin, and the power is not in your personal victory. The power is Jesus and what he did. So as you're thinking about your story, ask yourself, where is Jesus in this story? Where is the activity of God? And often when we think of a story, we think that it's not going to have impact unless it's really dramatic. And we see pictures of dramatic stories, and we think, I got to have that one if I can really ever do this. In fact, here some time ago, I had Todd Bartlett here to give his testimony. I don't know if you remember Todd coming, but Todd showed this picture to you. Go ahead and put this on the screen. You remember the guy that had the handwriting on his hand? So let me tell you a little bit about Todd. You can just leave that picture up there for right now. But Todd had a dream. And then there's you remember the story. It's a long, long story. But in the dream, he was asking an angel what the angel's name was. And the angel said, Hatid, and he didn't understand what he was saying. So the angel said, give me your hand. And in the dream, he gave his hand to the angel, and the angel wrote something on his hand. And then that was the end of the dream. He woke up the next morning, went into the bathroom to shave, and when he looked down on his hand, he saw that handwriting on his hand. And so he took a picture. That's his picture of his hand. And it absolutely freaked him out because this happened in a dream, and here it is actually written on his hand. And the thing is, it's written in perfect Hebrew. We've had this analyzed, and that means that the words that are on there, Hebrew writes from right to left, so it doesn't go from left to right. And when this occurred on Todd's hand, Todd's this computer geek kind of guy. Nothing weird happens to him, and so all of a sudden this stuff is happening in his life, and God had commissioned him to pray for somebody about their future and to commit for a whole year every day to pray for this person's future, and that has unfolded into amazing stories. But that word, Hatid, means her future, and he had no idea of that. He thought it was Chinese. He didn't even know what it was until he found somebody to analyze it. Well, the story continues on because just this last spring, he went into a gas station and he was filling up his vehicle with gas, and it wouldn't print out the receipt, so he went inside to get the receipt. And as they were printing the receipt out for him, there was this huge thunderclap, and the power went out all of a sudden, and then everything just kind of came back on, and the machine continued spitting out the receipt, and he took a picture. This is the receipt that came to him. And I don't know if you can see that very well on the left-hand side, and he had, after the receipt on the left-hand side was printed, he then had them reprint one on the right-hand side. The right-hand side is a regular receipt. On the left-hand side, and you probably can't see it from there very well, but we'll show you a closer up of it. This little section right here, there's 7 of them, and they're Hebrew words over and over and over and over again. They're right here. Hebrew words. 7 of them. Those machines, if you know anything about those machines, they don't even have the capacity to print out Hebrew words. And so it prints out this Hebrew word, and I don't know if you realize this is a bad picture of it, but this word right here, hatim, which means her future, that happened like a year and a half earlier, that's the exact same word that's printed here. It's the exact same Hebrew word, her future, 7 times printed over again. So that's just the continuing saga of what's happening in Todd's life. And he's like, I don't know why this stuff is happening to me. I don't know what's going on. But God has opened up all kinds of doors for him to share his faith with people. And a lot of people have gotten saved because of that. So I look at stories like that, and, there's like probably 6 stories of things like that have happened into his life that are so dramatic. And I think, man, my testimony stinks. When I compare me with that, I got nothing like that going on. He's just got all this crazy stuff, But what I've discovered is that those are super interesting and amazing to listen to. But your testimony, your story doesn't have to be some crazy dramatic thing like this. It can just be a normal story, because normal stories are never actually normal, because the power of the story isn't really about you. Its real power is about the grace of God, a God who chose to save you no matter where you come from. Because here's the thing. You've heard the cliche, leopards don't change their spots. And it's true, on their own, people don't change. But God changes people. And even if your story wasn't dramatic, if God came into your life and God changed you so you're a different person than you used to be before you encountered Christ, that's a miracle, because people don't change on their own. And as you tell people that story, God will use that to impact others. So really, our marching orders are pretty simple. Our marching orders are to go and engage in acts of kindness, touch people's lives with the kindness of Christ, and then to tell, to go and tell. And as they ask, why are you doing this? I just want to show the love of God in a practical way. And if they inquire further, then tell them your story. Let me tell you a story. And then you just tell them about your life before you met Christ, how you met Christ, and how your life has changed since you've met Christ. And God will use that to touch the lives of those, because we don't want to just do acts of kindness and leave it at that. Then all that will happen is they'll just think you're a really nice person. But we want to build that bridge from an act of kindness to being able to share our story of the one who is truly kind, who is Jesus. The greatest story ever told is retold every time that you and I share communion together. When you walked in, you saw that we have the communion trays out front here. And that's where our story intersects his. Because the greatest act of kindness in all of the world was Jesus laying down his life. We talk about being washed in the blood. You and I understand that means that Jesus he gave up his life. He literally spilled his blood to pay for sin, to destroy its power, so that access would be granted for you and I to come into relationship with a holy God. Because none of us are holy. We're messed up people. None of us are holy. So how could we possibly have a relationship with him who's perfectly holy? But Jesus, by paying with his life on the cross, has paid a penalty for the destructive nature of sin, so that it opens up access for you and I to have relationship with God, and to walk with him and to know him, and for him to come into our lives. And so when we take communion together, the juice represents that blood, and by drinking it, it's a symbolic way of saying that Jesus has offered his life for mine, and I'm saying yes. Because Jesus instructed his disciples to drink the juice, to eat the bread in remembrance of what he did. And it's just a way of symbolically saying yes to Christ. So I'm drinking the juice, and then when we eat the bread, it's the same thing. So we're going to pass the elements out in just a moment and give you an opportunity to respond. If you're not in a relationship with the Lord, if you're not walking with Christ, and you're not at a place where you're ready to cross that line of faith, just take the plates and just pass them by. That's fine. Nobody will judge you. This is a judgment-free zone. We're not going to judge you. But if you're at a place in your life where you're saying, I want to lay my sin down, lay my past down, and follow Jesus because I believe he's God, and I know he loves me, and I want to commit my life to him, then take the cup, take the bread, as all of us who are in relationship with him will do. Hold on to them, and at the very end, we'll eat and we'll drink together as a corporate body. So ushers, come on forward and we'll receive the elements.